Chapter 8 Conclusion. We began this book by noting that the animal advocacy movement has reached both a political and an intellectual impasse, and that we hope to contribute to overcoming both. In the previous chapters, we have focused on the intellectual impasse, showing how a wide range of pressing issues regarding human-animal interactions cannot be resolved from within a traditional animal rights theory perspective that focuses solely on the intrinsic moral standing of animals. To address these issues, we have argued, requires attending to the variable ways that animals are related to political institutions and practices of state sovereignty, territory, colonization, migration, and membership. This more relational and political approach helps illuminate blind spots within animal rights theory and clarify some of its well-known paradoxes and ambiguities. In this conclusion, we'd like to return to the political impasse, which is considerably more daunting. We noted in the introduction that while the animal advocacy movement has won some battles over the past century, it has essentially lost the war. The sheer scale of animal exploitation continues to expand around the globe, and the occasional victory in reforming the cruelest forms of animal use simply nibbles at the edges of the systemic human mistreatment of animals. For anyone concerned with the fate of animals, finding a way to overcome this political impasse is a priority. Developing new and expanded theories of animal rights may be intellectually stimulating and challenging, but can it make any difference to real-world campaigns and debates? We are not optimistic about the prospects for dramatic change in the short term, and we certainly have no delusions that one can somehow change the world simply by articulating better moral arguments. Humans have built our societies, our cultures, and our economies on animal exploitation, and many people have vested interests in perpetuating those practices in some form or another. Moral arguments are notoriously ineffective when they run so fully against the grain of self-interest and inherited expectations. Most of us are not moral saints. We are willing to act on our moral convictions when it costs us relatively little, but not when it requires us to give up our standard of living or way of life. People may be willing to ban fox hunting, but are notably less keen about giving up meat or leather, let alone ceasing colonization of wild animal habitat, extending co-citizenship to cats and cows, or embracing coexistence with pigeons and coyotes. Any theory that asks people to become moral saints is doomed to be politically ineffective, and it would be naive to expect otherwise. However, we do not believe that this is the whole story. In fact, one could argue that our addiction to animal exploitation is harming us, even killing us. Meat-centered diets are less healthy than vegetarian diets. Moreover, the agricultural processes needed to produce that meat rivaled transportation as a leading cause of global warming. Human colonization of wild animal territory is destroying the lungs of the planet, the vitality of our soils, the stability of weather systems, and the supply of fresh water. The simple fact is that the human species cannot survive on this planet if we do not become less dependent on the exploitation of animals and the destruction of their habitat. Indeed, some commentators have argued that the system of animal exploitation will inevitably lead to collapse of its own accord, even without any change in moral sensibilities. As Jim Montevelli puts it, quote, "We won't stop eating meat simply because it's the right thing to do," end quote. He thinks arguing people to give up meat is a losing proposition, but nonetheless, quote, "will be forced to stop," end quote. UN studies have shown that by 2025 there simply won't be enough water or land needed to sustain a meat diet for 8 billion people, and so, quote, "meat will disappear except as a luxury available to few," end quote. Montevelli predicts that there will eventually be a shift to an ethic that rejects eating animal flesh, but this will follow and not precede the environmental collapse of the meat industry. In this view, engaging in animal rights moral theory is pointless, not because it is powerless against the forces upholding animal exploitation, but because it is unnecessary given the long-term forces undermining animal exploitation. There are interesting echoes here with scholarly debates about the abolition of slavery. Some argue that slavery ended as a result of the campaigns of abolitionists who successfully managed to change people's moral sensibilities about the rights of black people. Others argue that slavery collapsed of its own accord as it proved increasingly economically inefficient. In the case of human slavery, most observers agree that both moral agitation and economic factors were important, and indeed that they were interconnected. Changing moral sensibilities encouraged people to identify potential self-interested reasons for abolishing slavery. Changing economic self-interest encouraged people to rethink their previous moral commitments. This complex and unpredictable interplay between moral conviction and perceptions of self-interest is a familiar refrain in the recent social science literature. It is widely accepted now that ideals and interest are not discrete and watertight categories, since people identify their self-interest in part based on their sense of who they are and what sorts of relationships they value in the world. To take an extreme example, few people would argue that prohibitions on cannibalism are a burden or sacrifice on their self-interest. People do not think of themselves as having self-interest in eating human flesh because they do not think of themselves as the sort of people who would even want to engage in that behavior. Similarly, we may hope one day that humans will not view prohibitions on eating animal flesh as a burden or sacrifice because people will not think of themselves as the sort of people who want to engage in that behavior. In this way, changing moral sensibilities redefine our sense of self and hence our sense of self-interest. Indeed, our sense of who we are and what we value is shaped by more than either narrow self-interests or explicit moral commitments. Our moral imagination can be enlarged by careful thought and reflection and through compassionate relationship, but it can also be enlarged via scientific and creative impulses, our desire to explore, to learn, to create beauty, connection, and meaning. We need to engage this larger human spirit in the animal justice project. Today, much of what animal rights theory demands will undoubtedly be seen by many people as an enormous sacrifice. The gap between the moral theory we are advancing and people's perceived interests or self-conceptions is vast. But that can change, and in unpredictable ways, and perhaps more quickly than one might think. As the environmental and economic costs of our system of animal exploitation and colonization become increasingly apparent, it will become increasingly urgent to develop new conceptual frameworks to help identify alternative visions of human-animal relations. We hope that this book contributes to that task, both in terms of the long-term vision it offers and in terms of the short-term strategies it recommends. In terms of long-term vision, our approach offers a more positive picture of the future of human-animal relations than is offered by traditional animal rights theory. To date, animal rights theory has focused primarily on a set of negative prohibitions: thou shalt not kill, use, or keep animals. In the process, animal rights theory has embraced a stark and simplistic conception of human-animal relations. Domesticated animals should be extinguished, and wild animals should be left alone. In short, there should be no human-animal relations. We have argued that this vision is not only an empirical non-starter, as humans and animals cannot be severed into hermetically sealed distinct environments, but also a political liability. Most humans come to understand and care for animals by having a relationship with them, by observing them, hanging out with them, caring for them, loving and being loved by them. The humans who care the most for the fate of animals are typically those involved in relationships with them, as companions or workmates, or as wildlife observers, conservationists, and ecological restorationists. Overcoming the political impasse will require drawing on this energy and these motivations. And yet the underlying message of animal rights theory is that humans cannot be trusted to have relationships with animals. We will inevitably exploit and harm them, and therefore we must cut ourselves off. This is not a message likely to galvanize animal lovers to fight for animal justice. Rather than cutting off relations between humans and animals, our long-term vision seeks to explore and embrace the full possibilities of such relations. This entails recognizing animals not just as individual subjects entitled to respect of their basic rights, but as members of communities, both ours and theirs, woven together in relations of interdependency, mutuality, and responsibility. This vision is far more demanding than the classic animal rights theory position that our obligation to animals is to let them be. But it is also a far more positive and creative vision, one that recognizes that human-animal relations can be compassionate, just, joyful, and mutually enriching. Any theory of animal rights will require humans to give up their ill-gotten gains from animal exploitation and colonization. But a politically effective animal rights theory will identify not just the sacrifices that justice demands of us, but also the rewarding new relationships that justice makes possible. And this in turn has implications for more short-term strategy. If our long-term goal is not just to abolish exploitation, but to build new relationships of justice, then even the short-term outlook is not quite as bleak as it first appears. The sheer scale of animal exploitation and colonization is increasing globally, but there are also countless experiments around the world in which humans are trying to find new ways to relate to animals. We have discussed several of these in the course of this book, but just to mention a few of them. Designated pigeon lofts with feeding and fertility control programs manage feral pigeon populations at sites from Jaipur to Nottingham, gradually persuading skeptics to abandon their murderous killing sprees. Some cities involve artists in the design of the lofts, turning them into sites of public art and participation, as well as peaceful interspecies coexistence. The city of Leeds in the UK is considering a proposal for erecting habitat high-rise dwellings, vertical green towers designed to accommodate and welcome birds, bats, and other wildlife in the heart of the city. A wildlife refuge in eastern Ontario rescues animals in distress, from starving animals and orphan squirrels to turtles with shells smashed by car impacts. All receive careful medical attention while limiting exposure to humans in hopes of full rehabilitation and successful return to the wild. A California sanctuary rescues chickens. It cares for their shelter, nutrition, and medical needs, including specially designed pens and runs to protect the chickens from nocturnal predators and from exposure to avian influenza. The chickens have extensive freedom of movement and opportunity to form attachments and engage in a range of activities and behaviors. No chickens are killed. They live out their natural lives, often for many years after they stop producing eggs. The sanctuary workers collect and sell some of the eggs. More and more people describe their dog and cat companions as full members of the family and demand access for these family members to top-notch medical care, emergency services, and public space on the same basis that human citizens take as their due. Conservationists around the world use their growing knowledge of animal migration patterns to redirect human development in ways that protect and reestablish wildlife corridors and viable habitats. Shipping routes are being relocated, wildlife overpasses are being constructed, green spaces are being reclaimed and linked. In these countless and other examples discussed throughout this book, we see humans attempting to establish new and ethical relations with animals. These relations go far beyond ideas of humane treatment. They also go far beyond ideas of non-intervention and respect for basic negative rights. Implicitly, at least, they embody a more comprehensive conception of human-animal relations, one which recognizes that we are inevitably involved in complex relationships with animals and owe to them extensive positive duties. In our view, these experiments can be seen as the building blocks of a future Zoopolis, and our goal has been in part to provide a theoretical framework that can make sense of them. Each in its own way is showing that new relationships of justice are possible and sustainable. Humans are distressingly reluctant to give up the benefits from animal exploitation and colonization, and that is unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. But there is also a great deal of unease about these ill-gotten gains, and a great deal of creative energy invested in exploring new possibilities, and a great deal of learning to be gleaned from these experiments. And yet much of this is invisible to the existing mainstream philosophy of animal rights, which lacks the theoretical tools to make sense of the moral value of such experiments, either perceiving them as tangential to the primary animal rights project of dismantling factory farms and other direct forms of animal exploitation, or indeed condemning them out of hand for failing to stop using animals and learning to let them be. It is asking too much of moral arguments to expect them to overcome by themselves deeply entrenched cultural assumptions and the powerful forces of self-interest. But moral arguments should at least identify the moral resources that do exist, tapped and untapped, within our society, and should work to strengthen them. These moral resources for animal rights include ordinary folk who bond with their companion animals, dedicated members of wildlife organizations, and ecologists working for habitat conservation and restoration. These individuals don't typically identify themselves as supporters of animal rights, and a few of them are vegans who consistently denounce practices of animal exploitation in their daily lives. Nevertheless, there are important ways in which they are indeed working for animal rights, rights to sovereign territory, rights to fair terms of coexistence, and rights to citizenship. The animal rights movement needs to embrace an expanded conception of animal rights, which can include all of these natural allies in the fight for animals. We need to get people excited about the project of justice for animals, tapping into the enormous well of human creative, scientific, and affiliative energies. It will be by now no secret to readers that we are big fans of Star Trek and its ethic for interspecies contact, coexistence, and cooperation. This ethic can be summarized as follows. Encounters with new life forms should be governed by caution, curiosity, and respect. Species not yet ready or willing to benefit from contact with the Federation should be left unmolested to develop along their own trajectories. First contact is made with species on the cusp of intergalactic travel to assess the desirability of membership in the Federation's political community. And this critical first contact is entrusted to the Federation's most able diplomats, armed with the best science available and sophisticated technological resources to facilitate communication to the extent possible, and guided by an overriding injunction to do no harm. The USS Enterprise encounters many species incapable of producing Shakespeare, or Spock, or Data, human language, or human moral reflection, and yet all are approached with the same ethic of respect for their own uniquely adaptive intelligence and consciousness. It would be hard to imagine a more stark contrast to the reality of interspecies contact here on Earth. Just imagine, though, how thrilled we'd be to discover an elephant or whale or parrot-like animal in another galaxy, how we'd spare no resources to learn about this wonderful new creature, to appreciate its uniqueness, and to make friendly contact to any extent possible. Imagine how appalled we'd be at the thought of killing off this species, or enslaving it, or robbing it of the resources needed to live. And yet this is exactly how we treat the unique and wonderful animals who share planet Earth. We seem incapable of perceiving them with the respect and awe that would undoubtedly characterize a fresh encounter, with new eyes, on neutral territory, divorced from the context of our largely tragic history together. We hope that this book offers a fresh set of lenses for considering animals as more than just animals, or interchangeable members of endangered species, or passively suffering victims. We offer instead a picture of animals as complex individual actors embedded in webs of social, not just ecological relationship, and as political animals, sovereigns and citizens of self-determining communities. This perspective provides the basis for a fresh start, for first contact all over again. Fortunately, most animal communities do not retain detailed intergenerational records of abusive treatment by humans. This means we can turn a new page more easily than in the context of human injustice, where memories are often long and bitter, hampering the prospects of forward-looking justice. We face no such impediments in the animal case. It's down to us.